You ever walked into a church and heard the pastor or priest say, "Welcome to the house of the Lord," or "Welcome to the Father's house"? Yeah, let's talk about that. So the history of church buildings is pretty neat. We all know that the word that's been translated as church is ekklesia, which nowadays is debatably translated as an assembly, and some define it as called outlets. And it's where we get the word ecclesiastical, pertaining to the church, and ecclesiology, the study of doctrine concerning the church. And this ecclesia, or ekklesia, pops up in the Bible a massive 114 to 115 times. And not one single time does it refer to a building. Now, tradition says the site of the Last Supper became the first church, but the first real record we have of the ecclesia being referred to as a meeting place was from Clement of Alexandria in 190 AD. But that had more to do with meeting in private homes or beneath the streets in the catacombs to venerate the bones of the martyrs that had given their lives for the faith. Now, there is evidence of a mid-3rd century house that was converted into a singular purpose church building in Dura Europa, Syria. But most archaeologists currently believe that the Aqaba Church and the Megiddo churches to be the world's oldest known specific church structures. But they weren't built until the late 3rd century. But when Christianity became a recognized legal religion in 313 AD and the Emperor of Rome declared himself Christian, Constantine took worship out of the homes and wanted buildings. And he preferred buildings that resembled the basilica, large Roman public buildings with multiple functions, typically built alongside the town's forum as worship spaces. And many of our current church customs are still rooted in the practices that developed in those buildings, but not necessarily the early church. Now, on the outside, these basilicas look pretty plain, but inside, whoa, Nelly, they were nice. And most of these buildings were built atop catacombs and cemeteries that held the bones of the saints, ascribing to the belief that the bones of saints still had relevant powers. And early basilicas faced east, so the sun fell on the speaker at the altar, and the altar in these churches was a holdover from Greco-Roman pagan temples, as the altar would hold the bones of a martyr or a relic and what was needed for the Eucharistic function. Now, some of you might be going, "Now wait a minute, Ken. The Jews had altars," and you are absolutely 100% correct. But the altars they used were very different and used for completely different functions, and they definitely didn't hold the bones of saints or their relics. Remember, by the 4th century, Judaism and Christianity had completely split, and Christian converts were mostly Gentiles, not Jews, and anti-Semitism was everywhere. So Christian church altars had very little to do with those of the Hebraic faith. In fact, up until the Middle Ages, if you didn't have some kind of holy relic at the altar, your church wasn't even considered legit, and you'd get in crazy trouble. There was also a special chair at the altar reserved for the speaker, representing the speaker's authority, and we still do this today. And this is also a holdover from earlier Greco-Roman belief systems. But the biggest thing with officially designated church buildings were the marked shift from the early Christian community gathering model in homes, as followers of the way gathered around. They wouldn't all face one way at a single speaker. Church was more about community than getting preached at. But this all changed with official church buildings. Rituals were developed that we still see today in some settings. The walking in of the incense or candles, the lighting of lights when the priests enter. All of these things were holdovers of customs from Roman temples, as this occurred whenever Caesar or his officials or priests entered pagan temples, as was the Roman custom of opening service with professional and processional music, which was how earlier pagan religions in Rome opened their time of worship. After the basilica phase, the building style generally went to the Byzantine phase, which began to integrate Platonic design, stained glass, inducing color to affect mood, etc., etc. This is still with us today. Notice the use of green when it's time for an offering, or reds during altar call, purples during solemn moments. I'm not speaking against these things, but what I am saying is these ideas, which are designed to elicit emotional responses in formal settings, have been around for a very, very long time. And after the Reformation, the pulpit became the center focus of the Protestant church, shifting attention to the sermon instead of a building's ambiance that was designed to impact contemplation. But most church buildings still have a narthex, where you go up a short little flight of stairs and enter a small room before going into the actual sanctuary. And originally this was designed to prepare the soul in moving from a secular to a sacred space. Also, the altar rail and the raising up of the speaker onto a platform, symbolically demonstrating the effort the congregant needed to make to enter into the holy presence. There is design to every church building that exists that we take for granted, but the original designs all had spiritual reasoning. And I can keep going. All in all, the church building, as it was designed in the 4th century and all the way to the present day, was a setting aside of a sacred space, a place that was venerable. And I love church buildings. I do. I grew up in them. But making a church building more indicative and symbolic of our faith than the people in them, the actual church, creates a big problem. In honoring the building more than the people, it creates a dividing line in the heart and the soul, making a building more symbolic of our faith rather than who we are. Our identity, our actions, our very being as children of God symbolizes the separation of secular and spiritual. But in truth, there is no separation. Because if our model is Jesus, he did not separate the secular from the spiritual. To the ancient Hebrew mind, that was a completely foreign concept, and it creates disjunction in our minds. I go to worship instead of living a life of worship. I go to church instead of I am the church. I'm waiting on a move of God instead of I am a move of God. And this is all up in our modern language. You've heard pastors say, "Welcome to the house of the Lord," or "Thanks for coming this Sunday to the Father's house." I've said it from the pulpit. I've said it from the platform. But the fact is, that is not scriptural. In fact, it's a thoroughly pagan concept. And we are in error when we say it. The Christian God doesn't live in buildings of stone. God's people are his temple. In Acts 7:48 through 50, 1 Corinthians 3:16, and 1 Peter 2:5 are just a few of the verses that confirm this. Even in the temple of Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies, God didn't live there. God's Spirit would dwell there. But in the Jewish mind, the Holy of Holies was the place where heaven and earth connected. But a stone temple isn't where heaven and earth connects anymore. Heaven meets earth through you. You want to know where God actually lives? Look at your hands. You want to see what the power of the Holy Spirit can do? Look at your hands. Look, if we want to see the awareness of the glory of the Lord fill the earth as the waters cover the seas, then we have to start living in spirit and truth. Buildings are just that, buildings. I love them, but God doesn't live in them. He lives in us. And when we say a building is the house of God, we are in essence saying that I have to go somewhere else to experience God, whereas in truth, he's already living in me. And that's John 17. Can you encounter God in a building? Absolutely, because in a church you'll find believers, so you'll find God there. But a building is just that, is a building. Can church buildings have a power to them? Yeah, for sure. I truly believe that. I've experienced that. But does God live in that building? God lives in people, and his glory is everywhere. You are the house of the Lord. You are the Father's house. The religious spirit and the spirit of man seeks to keep God quantified in temples instead of believers stepping into the reality that we are God's temples. It creates lazy believers who cast their responsibilities upon clergy to handle the work of the kingdom, when Jesus intended us, you, me, and we to release his kingdom upon the earth. Church is something we are. But most of us truly don't believe that. Our language betrays us. Our cute mottos like, church is not a building, it's a family. But have you ever said, I'm going to family this Sunday morning? Come on. I love church, and yes, we should never forsake the assembly of the saints, but the assembly of the saints has nothing to do with designated buildings. And when our building budgets are greater than our mission and outreach budgets, when we're focused more on building improvements than in the health of our fellow man, we've got serious problems. Because Jesus ain't coming for temples and buildings, and at the end of your days, he's not going to ask you how many buildings you built or how many people you fit in them. He's going to ask you if you loved and lived with everything you had, if you loved him, and if you loved your neighbor as you loved yourself. And I hope we have the strength to answer accordingly. God bless. You are loved. See you soon.